Imagine a valley of freezing mud and ash. 2 million human soldiers are ordered to stand completely still.
Right, just stand there and be butchered, day after agonizing day.
Exactly. They are starving, their skin is blackened by frostbite, and they're dying in droves. But they're not allowed to retreat.
And they're not allowed to reinforce their positions either.
No. They're ordered to bleed out in the snow for one singular purpose, which is to convince an alien god that they're weak.
It's a staggering concept.
It is. Welcome, Historicus Perfectus, to the shadowed corridors of the Historical Recovery Department. If you are receiving this transmission, your clearance codes have been verified by the inner sanctums of the Logos Historica the Verita.
I am Historitor Ophelia Prexane.
And I am Historitor Reston Cetus. We are here because the veil of ignorance that protects the wider Imperium simply cannot be permitted to obscure your vision. What follows is a presentation on information data extracted from the manuscripts of the Separata Sector, specifically the Planet Canaz section.
And we must stress, this is strictly accessible only to the Historicus Perfectus. Do not attempt to transcribe this data.
The shadows of our department are always watching.
Always.
So to understand the raw data of this localized apocalypse, you really must first comprehend the stage upon which it was set.
Right, Planet Canaz.
Yes. It is not merely a dying world. I mean, it is a world being actively murdered.
The atmosphere itself is weaponized. It's wrapped in this unnatural, howling, psychic blizzard.
A localized warp storm, essentially.
Exactly. Designed not just to freeze the flesh, but to fundamentally numb the human soul. 2 billion human beings once called Canaz their home. It was a thriving, prosperous agricultural jewel.
And now?
Now, that population has been systematically eradicated. The billions have perished, just frozen into the planetary wastes like grotesque statues.
And the survivors are backed into a corner.
The surviving few millions, yes. Backed into a desperate, squalid corner at the final, heavily shielded spaceport. They are starved. They are riddled with disease.
And completely isolated from the wider Imperium.
Completely. It is a portrait of suffocating desperation.
It is. But while our archives hold staggering volumes of data regarding the overarching isolation and the macro-level siege of Canaz, our deep dive today is surgically narrow.
We are looking exclusively at the contents of the recovered field reports, detailing a decisive, horrifying engagement known in the manuscripts as the ambush in the valley.
Right, we are not here to discuss grand strategy or orbital logistics. We are here to examine the anatomy of a massacre.
Layer by agonizing layer.
To understand the true, chilling cost of survival in the dark. So we must begin by asking the foundational question of this engagement.
Why this specific valley?
Exactly. Out of a 40-kilometer defensive perimeter, why did the combined might of an advanced alien host converge on this one desolate stretch of frozen, blood-stained earth?
The Scale-Tan army led by Farseer Sarkanar.
Yes. And the recovered data reveals a truth that is, frankly, difficult to digest.
Because the valley was a lie.
It was a perfectly orchestrated deception, written entirely in human blood. I mean, the Xenos were not foolish.
No, they utilized alien probes, technologies that border on the arcane.
Right. They repeatedly scanned the spaceport's defensive line. They bypassed standard thermal and kinetic augers, peering into the very structural integrity of the Imperial trenches.
And what they found in the southern valley appeared to be an open wound.
It registered as the undeniable Achilles heel of the human line, manned by exhausted troops, exhibiting uncoordinated suppression fire, and featuring critical gaps in anti-orbital shielding.
But that vulnerability was meticulously manufactured.
It was.
Yeah.
But before we dissect the mechanical wrath of the trap itself, we really have to look at how Farseer Sarkanar initiated the engagement.
The opening salvo.
Right. It defied mortal comprehension and fundamentally altered the geography of the battlefield.
It wasn't just a physical attack. It was a methodical, terrifying erasure of geography, infrastructure, and morale.
The Aeldari forces didn't just march across the permafrost, did they?
Not at all. They unleashed a localized orbital and heavy artillery barrage of such intense thermal yield that it instantaneously transmuted the freezing terrain.
Just imagine the sensory whiplash experienced by the Imperial defenders there.
It's unfathomable. One moment they are shivering in sub-zero temperatures, suffocating in a psychic blizzard.
And a fraction of a second later, orbital lance strikes pierce the cloud cover.
Exactly. And the permafrost beneath their boots is flash melted into a boiling caldera of mud and ash.
The sheer kinetic shock of that. The water in the ground doesn't just melt, it sublimates instantly.
Creating localized steam explosions that literally cook men alive in their own trenches.
It's horrific. And from that blinding, boiling mud emerged a vanguard of unimaginable lethality.
The reports detail a host that reads like a nightmare.
Towering Wraith Guards, entirely immune to small arms fire.
Silent rangers operating at the fringes of human vision.
Striking scorpions blending into the shadows of the smoke.
Warlock conclaves weaving witchcraft that short-circuits human synapses.
And those anti-gravitic vipers gliding effortlessly above the slaughter.
But the true horror was the mechanized centerpiece.
The imposing, colossal Wraith Seer.
Yes, and what stands out in the descriptions of this vanguard is the sheer, nauseating speed.
The human optic nerve literally struggled to process their movements.
Well, that speed is not just a physical trait. It is a weaponized psychological advantage.
Right, because the human brain attempts to predict movement based on the laws of physics it understands.
Exactly. When an entity moves from a standstill to a lethal strike in a blur that defies inertia, it induces a profound physiological panic.
Let's examine how the Aeldari Rangers utilize this.
Operating from the obscured rear lines, these snipers began their work with cold surgical precision.
The physical mechanism of their long rifles utilizes complex crystalline containment fields.
To fire needle-like projectiles at hypervelocity, yes.
And the snipers were eliminating human officers so efficiently that the victims were dead before the sound of the gunshot ever reached the trenches.
Their heads completely snapped back and shattered.
I mean, you are a guardsman pinned in the boiling mud. The air smells like copper and scorched earth. You look to your lieutenant for a shred of guidance, and he is simply erased from existence.
And a full second later, the crack of the rifle echoes down the valley.
It isn't just that the chain of command is broken. It is that the human mind cannot reconcile the sequence of events.
Cause and effect are entirely decoupled.
It is designed to induce absolute paralyzing terror before the main infantry force even engages.
It is the absolute pinnacle of asymmetric warfare. But to fully grasp the dynamics of this slaughter, we have to analyze the psychological state of the Aeldari leadership.
The autarch in command of the wider siege.
Right. The data shows he was operating under a crippling, toxic impatience.
Prior infiltration methods had failed, hadn't they?
They had. He had deployed elite walk spiders to sabotage the spaceport shields in the preceding weeks.
And those highly specialized teleporting shock troops had been ground into dust by entrenched Imperial veterans.
Which bred the deep, culturally abhorrent frustration within the Aeldari command. I mean, they view humans as vermin.
And to be stalemated by vermin is a stain on their martial pride.
Exactly. They didn't just want to breach the port. They desperately needed a swift, glorious, and aesthetically pristine execution.
To wash away the humiliation of their previous failures.
Yes. And this overwhelming arrogance blinded them to the reality of the valley. They saw a weakness because their cultural pride demanded that a weakness exists.
And their arrogance was matched only by their apocalyptic destructive capability. We have to address the visceral obliteration caused by the Wraith Seer on the left flank.
That was not a standard heavy combat walker.
No, it was a towering engine of bone and psychic wrath.
Yeah.
It waded into the heavy weapons emplacements, first utilizing a weapon known as a destructor.
Bathing entire squads in purifying psychic fire.
Literally burning the souls from their bodies before the flesh even blistered.
But that was merely the prelude, right?
Right. It then channeled raw, unadulterated warp energies through its primary armament, the D cannon.
And the D cannon, or distortion cannon, represents a fundamental circumvention of physical defense.
It doesn't fire a kinetic projectile.
Nor does it project a thermal beam. It weaponizes the chaotic energies of the Imperium itself.
So when it fires, it creates a temporary, localized tear in the fabric of real space,
violently merging the material universe with the hellscape of the warp.
The field reports are horrifyingly explicit here. An Imperial bunker, reinforced with meters of rockcrete, plasteel, and localized void shielding, was housing a vital laser cannon battery.
And the D cannon didn't shatter the rockcrete.
It didn't melt the plasteel, it simply unmade it.
The visual distortion is described as a sphere of absolute, light-consuming blackness that bloomed over the bunker.
The silence was deafening, followed by a thunderclap as the atmosphere violently rushed in to fill the sudden vacuum.
The fortification, the heavy weapon, and the screaming gun crew were entirely erased from the material plane.
Pulled directly into the warp. I mean, how does a commanding officer even process that?
They don't. Conventional military doctrine relies on cover, armor, and kinetic deflection.
When the enemy can simply delete a coordinate from reality, tactical defense becomes a mathematical impossibility.
It effectively reduces the Astra Militarum to biological chaff.
You cannot armor a guardsman against a weapon that tears a hole in reality.
You can only force them to watch as the very fabric of the universe consumes their comrades, knowing there is absolutely no physical countermeasure.
This was Farseer Sarkonar's statement of intent. The Aeldari were not engaging in a territorial dispute,
They were initiating an extermination protocol.
which forces us to confront a deeply unsettling reality about the human defenders.
The deception.
Right. To sell this elaborate deception, to make an intelligence as ancient and calculating as an Aeldari Farseer, truly believed that this valley was the breaking point the Imperial commanders had to feign total vulnerability.
The data confirms they intentionally simulated a poorly defended, collapsing line for weeks.
They accepted a staggering mortuary toll. How do you even issue that order?
It's hard to fathom.
You are commanding your own troops to act as a static meat grinder.
Yeah.
You are watching them starve, freeze, and be picked off by alien snipers.
And intentionally withholding heavy support just to make the enemy feel comfortable enough to walk into the valley.
The psychological toll on the human command structure must have been staggering.
It demands an absolute abdication of conventional morality.
Right.
The Imperial commanders on Canaz were not fighting a war of attrition or a war of territorial gain. They were fighting a war of absolute extinction.
In a binary equation where the only alternative to victory is the total annihilation of the human species in this sector.
Exactly. So the value of an individual human life, or even tens of thousands of human lives, mathematically approaches zero.
They weaponize their own casualties.
By bleeding profusely and visibly, they convinced the apex predator that the prey was in its death throes.
It is a masterclass in macabre strategic deception.
They utilized the enemy's own inherent prejudice. The Aeldari believe that humans are weak, disorganized, and easily broken.
They use that as the very bait for the trap.
And Sarkonar took that bait entirely.
He watched with cold, aesthetic pride as his vanguard tore through the human lines, thoroughly convinced that the battle was essentially a foregone conclusion.
But as the Wraithseer advanced and the Xeno infantry pushed deeper into the churning mud of the valley floor, the underlying reality of Canaz was revealed.
The mud, boiling with blood, ash, and the melted permafrost, hit a mechanical wrap of staggering proportions.
This is the critical pivot point in the archival data.
The Aeldari tactical augurs had assured Sarkonar that the extreme cold of the psychic blizzard, combined with their prior infiltration and sabotage, had rendered the heavy Imperial armor completely inoperable.
And objectively, it was an entirely logical, statistically sound assumption.
The ambient temperatures on Canaz prior to the orbital strike were low enough to freeze promethium fuel blocks into solid sludge.
And shatter unconsecrated steel upon impact.
The Aeldari advanced with the absolute certainty that they were facing unsupported, unmechanized infantry.
They fundamentally underestimated the fanatical, spiteful stubbornness of the Adeptus Mechanicus.
And the surviving Astra Militarum.
Right. The reports detail that as the Aeldari vanguard committed to the center of the valley, a mechanical war physically shook the blood-soaked earth.
It wasn't just a few engines. It was squadrons of Lumen Rust tanks suddenly surging to life from beneath the boiling mud and debris.
They hadn't been deployed from the rear.
No, they'd been buried there, entombed in the freezing earth, waiting for the signal.
We really must pause to dissect the sheer, unadulterated technical and physical torment required to execute this maneuver.
Keeping those massive, ancient internal combustion engines operational in sub-zero temperatures.
Completely hidden beneath the frozen mud without giving away a single thermal or electromagnetic signature to Aeldari sensors.
It transcends mere mechanical aptitude.
It is an act of fanatical religious spite. The tech priests and the tank crews were sealed inside those freezing metal coffins for weeks,
They would have had to run the engines completely cold,
likely nursing the machine spirits of those tanks with their own body heat.
chanting litanies of preservation over frozen fuel lines while their own extremities blackened with frostbite.
They endured a slow, agonizing burial alive, purely for the opportunity to unleash hell at point-blank range.
And when that trap snapped shut, the violence was cataclysmic. Commander Gregory led the armored charge in a Leman Russ Vanquisher.
Supported by a heavy contingent of standard and demolisher variants.
The visual imagery captured in the field data is brutally stark. It strips away any illusion of martial nobility.
As the tanks surged forward out of the mud, they didn't maneuver around the dead.
No. The massive steel treads of the Imperial tanks physically crushed the frozen, shattered bodies of their own fallen guardsmen to gain traction.
When the enemy is closing in with nauseating speed, there is absolutely no time for reverence.
The dead are just another layer of the terrain.
Furthermore, this sudden armored surge was not an isolated, desperate action.
The precise moment the Lehman Russ engines roared to life, the wider trap activated with terrifying synchronization.
From the entrenched rear lines, entirely hidden from the initial Aeldari Auspex sweeps, a massive battery of Basilisk heavy artillery opened fire.
The humans had coordinated a devastating localized counteroffensive,
dropping earth-shattering ordnance precisely onto the coordinates where the Aeldari vanguard had massed.
They turned the valley floor into a cauldron of high explosives.
Yet, even with this brilliantly orchestrated deception, the human technology initially faltered.
The reports note a terrifying moment of realization for the Imperial armor.
The heavy, thunderous firepower of the Lehman Russ battle cannons was causing shockingly little initial damage to the Xeno vanguard.
Because the Aeldaris were simply too agile.
Their anti-gravitic platforms danced between the artillery shells.
And their advanced hollow fields and energy shields deflected or absorbed the kinetic impacts of the tank fire.
It seemed as though the trap, despite its sheer brilliance and the horrific cost and human suffering required to set it, was going to fail against the overwhelming superiority of Aeldari physics.
But warfare, especially in the grim darkness of this sector, is rarely dictated solely by technological specifications.
Or statistical probabilities. It is dictated by the chaotic, unpredictable nature of human desperation.
And the turning point of this entire armored engagement, the moment that shifted the momentum of the massacre, rests on a single, mathematically improbable event.
The impossible shot.
Precisely. Amidst the deafening roar of artillery, the blinding smoke, and the nauseating blurting speed of the Xeno host, Commander Gregory's Lehman Russ Vanquisher managed to lock its targeting cogitators onto the towering Wraith Seer.
This was the exact same engine of destruction that had been effortlessly pulling human bunkers into the warp just moments prior.
Let's break down the mechanics of that shot. The Vanquisher cannon doesn't fire a standard high-explosive shell.
No, it fires a highly specialized, hyper-velocity, armor-piercing round.
It requires immense stabilization and perfect calculation.
Firing at a target that moves with Aeldari grace, through a battlefield obscured by boiling mud and localized psychic distortion.
It borders on the miraculous.
The manuscript describes the impact with a deafening metallic crash.
It was a direct, kinetically perfect hit.
The hypervelocity shell bypassed the Wraith Seer's protective fields through sheer, unadulterated mass and speed, completely shattering the colossal construct.
The previously invincible towering engine of bone and warpcraft was violently, instantly reduced to burning, scattered wreckage.
It is impossible to overstate the psychological shockwave that this single kinetic event generated across the battlefield.
The Aeldari rely heavily on utilizing these massive wraith constructs to inspire paralyzing terror in lower species.
They are silent, relentless, and perceptually immortal.
To see one not just damaged, but utterly and violently obliterated by crude internal combustion, human machinery fundamentally fractured the reality the Aeldari had constructed.
Conversely, the field data explicitly notes a gut-wrenching primal roar of jubilation echoing down the entire human trench line.
It was the ultimate proof of concept. It proved that the alien gods could bleed.
It proved that the Xenos, for all their blinding speed, their ancient sorcery, and their aesthetic perfection, were ultimately still subject to the blunt force physics of high-explosive ordnance.
That singular spike in morale was the catalyst the infantry needed to rally.
The heavy weapon squads, who had been cowering in the mud from the sniper fire and the terrifying warp tiers, suddenly found their resolve.
Emboldened by the burning carcass of the Wraith Seer, they hoisted their last cannons and missile launchers over the trench lips
and tore into the remaining Wraith Guards.
The disciplined, overlapping fields of human fire began causing severe, catastrophic damage to the alien heavy infantry.
It serves as a masterclass in the fragile nature of momentum and asymmetrical combat.
The Aeldari tactical doctrine relies entirely on maintaining absolute momentum, right?
Yes, an overwhelming psychological dominance. They do not fight wars of attrition, they fight wars of execution.
And the very moment that psychological dominance was punctured by Gregory's impossible shot, the human defenders leveraged their only true advantage.
Brute force firepower and sheer numerical stubbornness.
It's the ultimate trap. Sarkanar is the predator playing with a wounded animal, entirely oblivious that the animal's ribs are lined with steel teeth, just waiting for him to bite down.
But we have to look at the spiritual cost of this victory.
What does it cost a human soul, from the strategic commanders safely in the rear to the freezing infantrymen holding the line, to realize that their ultimate trump card isn't superior tactics or advanced technology?
Their only real weapon is simply their boundless capacity to die.
They didn't win that armored engagement by out-engineering the Aeldari. They won it by willingly enduring weeks of relentless slaughter just to get the enemy close enough to punch in the mouth.
It cost them their humanity. That is the fundamental, inescapable truth of the Separata Sector's continued survival.
When you are fighting an enemy that is millions of years older, impossibly faster, and technologically vastly superior, you cannot rely on elegance.
You cannot rely on clean tactics. You must rely purely on endurance and the grotesque capacity to absorb horrific, mind-shattering punishment until the enemy finally overextends.
It is the triumph of the anvil over the hammer, but the anvil is forged entirely from human suffering.
And as we move from the deafening clash of heavy armor on the valley floor to the claustrophobic, suffocating nightmare of the trenches themselves, we see exactly what that suffering looks like up close.
While the Lehman Rust tanks clashed with the giant Wraith constructs in the mud, the infantry lines dissolved into a desperate close-quarters hell.
Because the Aeldari vanguard hadn't just attacked the front, they had already infiltrated the perimeter.
The striking Scorpions.
These are the Aeldari's dedicated close combat infiltration specialists.
Clad in heavy, segmented aspect armor that utilizes advanced mimetic technology to literally blend with the shadows and ambient smoke.
They wield incredibly vicious chainswords designed to bite through human flesh and reinforced flak armor with terrifying, frictionless ease.
The recovered tactical logs indicate that while the human attention was focused on the orbital strike and the Wraithseer, the Scorpions had completely bypassed the heavy forward defenses.
They slipped silently into the dark, labyrinthine bowels of the Imperial trenches and began systematically slaughtering the command platoons from within.
The sensory details in the reports are deeply unsettling.
The trenches were pitch black, choked with smoke that smelled heavily of ozone, burning promethium, and scorched meat.
The human defenders were experiencing the sheer, unadulterated terror of an unseen enemy.
Shadows would literally detach from the trench walls. A high-pitched hum of a chainsword would sound for a fraction of a second, and a man would be cut to ribbons before he could even raise his lasgun.
The center line was in a state of total rapid collapse. They left a senior commissar brutally wounded, his chest opened up, bleeding out onto the ice.
It was the absolute brink of a catastrophic rout.
But from that blinding ozone-scented smoke emerged a figure that the archival data describes in almost mythical, terrifying terms.
Commissar Kalen Vork.
Commissar Vork represents the extreme, necessary brutality of Imperial discipline.
He arrived at the collapsing center not on foot, but mounted upon a massive, terrifying warhorse designated Hellbreaker.
This was not a standard equine beast.
No, it was a product of severe genetic modification, bred for immense strength, enhanced aggression, and the ability to carry a fully armored man through freezing, thigh-deep mud without faltering.
If we look at Vork's background, we understand exactly why he was the man for this moment.
He is not a noble hero out of a propaganda pit.
He is a child of the Scala Progenium, an orphan raised in a ruthless, highly regimented environment designed to forge men who enforce discipline through absolute terror.
He bears a heavily modified, glowing red bionic eye.
And his personal doctrine of survival is so draconian, so utterly devoid of empathy, that his own troops genuinely fear his gaze far more than they fear the Xenos blades.
He is a man who fundamentally believes that pity or hesitation is a crack in humanity's armor that the alien will exploit.
And in the claustrophobic nightmare of a collapsing trench, that is precisely the kind of monster required to restore order.
When Vork arrived atop Hellbreaker, he did not offer rousing words of encouragement.
He did not appeal to their sense of duty.
The manuscript states he ruthlessly, calmly ordered his remaining forces to open point-blank, indiscriminate fire into the melee, regardless of the danger to their own comrades.
He brought absolute, uncompromising violence to bear against the panic.
And then he personally sought out the leader of the enemy infiltration, the Scorpion Exarch.
The imagery is cinematic, but entirely devoid of romance. Vork's face is described as impassive, like carved stone, illuminated only by the harsh red glare of his bionic eye cutting through the smoke.
He didn't engage in a protracted duel.
He rode Hellbreaker directly into the Exarch's pass, leveled his heavy bolt pistol, and executed the Aeldari elite at point-blank range.
It was a brutal physical rejection of Xeno superiority.
He broke the infiltration through sheer, terrifying force of will. But while Vort violently stabilized the mud of the trenches, the skies above the valley were a completely different, uncontested domain.
The human forces desperately attempted to dominate the airspace to protect their artillery, but the technological disparity was simply too vast to overcome with standard ballistics.
The Aeldari deployed Vipers and Shining Spears.
These are sleek, anti-gravitic platforms operating with a gravity-defying grace that makes a mockery of aerodynamic laws.
They effortlessly danced around the desperate, uncoordinated volleys of Imperial anti-air fire.
The human targeting cogitators simply couldn't keep up.
The last cannons and missile launchers were far too slow. They were attempting to track targets that moved with impossible, erratic agility, pivoting on a dime in midair.
And the Aeldari retaliation was swift, methodical, and mutilating.
The Vipers rained highly lethal, concentrated plasma and shrapnel fire down upon the heavy weapon positions, surgically silencing the human guns in bursts of blue light.
Even the heavy Lemon Rust tanks attempted to pivot their massive turrets to engage the agile flyers.
An act of sheer desperation that failed miserably, as their hydraulic traverse speeds were entirely inadequate.
The human anti-air defense network completely fundamentally failed.
Which presents a fascinating, albeit horrific, tactical breakdown for our analysis.
When your advanced technology fails, when your targeting augers are too slow, your missiles cannot track the target. And your armor is being bypassed, standard military doctrine usually dictates an immediate retreat.
Or the rapid deployment of specialized countermeasures.
But the Astra Militarum on Canaz had neither the space to retreat nor the technology to counter.
So what happens when lasers and tracking missiles are too slow?
Humanity resorts to the absolute lowest, most primal form of blunt force trauma available.
They unleash the Ogrins.
Precisely. Of humans.
Massive, genetically stable offshoots of the human baseline.
Possessing childlike, rudimentary intellects but incredibly bestial, titanic physical strength, they are living battering rams.
The manuscript paints a picture here that borders on the surreal. From the freezing, blood-soaked mud of the forward trenches, these brutal, heavily muscled giants literally leaped into the air.
They didn't use targeting matrices.
They didn't calculate trajectory.
They used raw, unevolved, brute muscle mass.
They physically lunged into the low-flying flight paths of the Shining Spears, the most elegant, sleek, anti-gravitic jet bikes in the Aeldari arsenal.
And tore them out of the sky with their bare hands and short-range, explosive ripper guns.
I want you to truly visualize that contrast. On one hand, you have the Shining Spears.
The absolute peak of Aeldari aeronautic grace, warriors who have spent centuries meditating on the aerodynamic flow of combat.
Riding machines that defy gravity itself.
On the other hand, you have massive, mud-caked, screaming giants jumping from a trench and using sheer crushing physical weight to drag those centuries of martial perfection down into the bloody dirt.
It forces a profound, highly uncomfortable philosophical question. The absolute peak of alien technology, capable of gliding flawlessly through a psychic snowstorm, was brought low by the absolute lowest, most primitive form of blunt force brutality in the Imperial arsenal.
Is that a victory of the indomitable human spirit, or is it merely a regression to pure barbarism?
When the only conceivable way to defeat the elegant is to become the absolute savage, what does that say about the evolutionary trajectory of humanity in this war?
It suggests that the war in the Separata Sector has violently stripped away all remaining illusions of civilized conflict.
It is a war of raw biological survival.
Grand tactical aesthetics, advanced aerodynamic theory, and elegant combat doctrines are utterly meaningless against the sudden, overwhelming application of primitive, bone-breaking force.
The Aeldari fundamentally rely on perfection. The humans rely on a sheer, stubborn, highly irrational refusal to die cleanly.
But that human defiance, brilliant and brutal as it was ultimately just a spark in the dark.
The trap had successfully bled the Aeldari. It had shattered their mechanized Wraithseer, it had broken their stealth infiltration, and it had literally dragged their elite cavalry into the mud.
But the sheer violence of that human counterattack, the sudden jubilant defiance, created a psychic shockwave in the Imperium.
And in a universe where emotion fuels reality, that much sudden, aggressive human defiance acts like blood in the water.
It drew the attention of something far worse than a tank or a sniper.
It drew the attention of a literal god of murder.
The Avatar of Cain.
The manuscript does not describe its entry into the fray as a tactical deployment. It describes it as the manifestation of divine wrath upon the front line.
We are no longer talking about a machine, a combat walker, or a highly trained soldier.
We are talking about an entity constructed of molten iron, animated by a shard of a dying god.
The reports state its sheer ambient heat was so intensely overwhelming that the blood-soaked ice and boiling mud of the valley floor instantly began to flash vaporize
into thick, suffocating steam simply by it walking upon it.
The Avatar is the physical manifestation of the Aeldari god of war. It is a walking, towering furnace of magma and unadulterated psychic rage.
The brilliant human trap, no matter how flawlessly executed by Commander Gregory and his buried limb and rust tanks, could not possibly account for the sudden introduction of a supernatural deity.
A general can calculate armor penetration, ballistic trajectory, and localized thermal signatures. A general cannot calculate for divine mythic wrath.
The Avatar executed a terrifying, incandescent vengeance upon the battlefield. It bypassed the infantry entirely and targeted the physical focal point of the human resistance.
Commander Gregory's Lehman Russ Vanquisher.
The colossal Imperial tank that had so heroically shattered the Wraith Seer was less than nothing to the Avatar.
Wielding a colossal molten sword known as the Wailing Doom, the Avatar closed the distance in terrifying strides.
It effortlessly sheared through the heavy, reinforced plasteel armor of the Vanquisher's turret as if it were parchment,
reducing the ancient war machine to a pile of burning, melted scrap and killing Commander Gregory and his crew instantly.
With the sudden, violent fall of the Vanquisher, the tide of the battle shifted irrevocably back to the Xenos.
The Aeldari infantry, the Guardian defenders, and the Warlock conclaves who had been faltering under the Imperial artillery rallied behind the terrifying, inspiring presence of their burning god.
They advanced with renewed fury, turning their concentrated firepower directly upon the Ogrins.
The same bestial, primitive strength that had so effectively dragged the shining spears from the sky was entirely useless against concentrated psychic blasts and high-yield plasma fire.
The manuscript states, with horrific clinical clarity, that the Ogrins were literally melted into puddles of their own bubbling flesh where they stood.
It is a devastating, sickening image.
But even in the midst of this overwhelming supernatural assault, the Aeldari continued to suffer from their own fatal cultural flaw.
The tactical reports note a bizarre, almost tragic vanity displayed by the Xeno infantry.
Even as they advanced through a muddy, chaotic, blood-drenched meat grinder of a trench war, the Aeldari insisted on maintaining perfect, highly aesthetic combat formations.
Their cultural arrogance demanded visual and martial order in the face of what they perceived as filthy human chaos.
They fundamentally refused to adapt to the ugly, disorganized reality of the battlefield.
And that aesthetic vanity cost them dearly.
Because they moved in tightly packed, perfectly synchronized, geometrically flawless formations, they made themselves the absolute ideal targets for the wide blast radius of the Imperial Basilisk artillery.
The Earthshaker shells rained down continuously on their perfect lines, causing massive, entirely unnecessary casualties among the Guardian squads.
They died perfectly aligned in the mud. But the human artillery, no matter how punishing, was simply not enough to stem the tide of a god.
The flanks, which had held so stubbornly during the initial armored clash, finally began to buckle and disintegrate under the combined overwhelming weight of the Avatar and the heavy Wraith Lords.
The right flank collapsed first.
The Wraith Lords breached the main French lines. These are massive, dreadnought-sized constructs, but armed with heavy flamers and high-yield star cannons.
They did not enter the trenches to engage in melee. They entered to cleanse.
They turned their heavy flamers directly upon a fully staffed, fortified human command center.
The manuscript is unambiguous about the sheer horror of this event. The entire command structure, complete with its localized cogitators and voxcasters, was consumed by a torrent of psychic fire.
The victims were heard screaming over the open vox channels as they burned to ash within their own sealed bunkers.
And on the left flank, where the ruins of Gregory's Vanquisher still burned, another Lehman Russ tank desperately attempted to play the hero.
It directed multiple point-blank volleys of high-explosive shells directly at the Avatar of Cain, frantically trying to bring the molten god down through sheer kinetic volume.
The shells did almost nothing, detonating harmlessly against the entity's aura of heat.
Seconds later, a Wraith Lord pivoted, focused the blinding beam of its bright lance, and obliterated the tank mercilessly, instantly vaporizing the crew compartment.
Even the smallest and most elusive of the Imperial defenders were not spared the cleansing wrath.
The Ratlings.
Small, abhuman snipers, who had bravely attempted to provide vital covering fire from concealed positions for the retreating infantry.
They were meticulously located by the deadly Aeldari Rangers.
The counterattack against them was incredibly swift and disproportionately cruel, resulting in massive, devastating casualties among the fragile sniper squads.
It forces a terrifying realization.
When you are fighting an enemy whose very footsteps boil the blood on the ground beneath them, whose weapons erase reality, and who are led by a literal manifestation of war, well, at what point does tactical military defense cease to be a military operation at all?
And become nothing more than a localized mass ritual sacrifice.
Exactly. The humans on the flanks weren't fighting to win at that point. They were just blindly throwing bodies into the furnace to slow the fire down by a few seconds.
That is the grim, unvarnished reality of a siege against an enemy that wields the raw power of the warp. Defense is merely the mathematical delaying of the inevitable.
The human trap was perfectly, flawlessly executed for the enemy they expected. A mechanized, conventional vanguard.
It was completely and utterly insufficient for the enemy they actually received. A shard of a dying god that defies the laws of physics.
The flanks were completely pulverized.
Yeah.
The valley, once a meticulously crafted, brilliant trap, was now nothing more than a sprawling slaughterhouse of burning iron and melted flesh.
We must guide you now to the final, chilling phase of this battle.
It is not a story of a last-minute victory.
It is a horrifying realization of the enemy's true strategic goal and a dark promise of what is to come.
The organized battle dissolved completely into a barbaric, close-quarters melee inside the suffocating, smoke-filled trenches.
All grand strategies on both sides had largely failed or been abandoned. It was now simply a matter of desperate, exhausted butchery.
In the absolute center of the line, Commissar Vork miraculously managed to hold his position.
He sat atop Hellbreaker, acting as a literal beacon of terror that motivated his exhausted, terrified, bleeding troops to fight far beyond the biological limits of human endurance.
But the extremities of the Imperial line were entirely rotten.
The Astra Militarum on the left and right flanks had been completely subjugated, crushed beneath the boots of Wraith Guards and the burning sword of the Avatar.
The impassive Farseer Sarkanar, watching the human flanks fully collapse from his command position, felt a cold, highly calculated satisfaction.
The trap had been painful, yes, but it had been broken. He finally gave the order to initiate the second true phase of his methodical plan.
The Aeldari had never actually intended to occupy the trenches of the valley.
The trenches, the Leman Russ tanks, the Ogryns, they were all merely an obstacle to be ground down.
With the flanks crushed and the anti-air capabilities of the humans completely neutralized, Sarkanar deployed his strategic reserves.
Sleek, agile, anti-gravitic transports. Squadrons of falcons and wave serpents suddenly emerged from the heavy, howling psychic blizzard.
The imagery described here is deeply haunting and perfectly encapsulates the disparity of this war.
The Aeldari transports glided silently, smoothly, utilizing advanced grav plating to float effortlessly over a literal sea of mangled, frozen, and burning human bodies.
They bypassed the brutally conquered, blood-filled trenches entirely.
They were fully loaded with fresh, untouched Aeldari reserve troops, and they accelerated relentlessly without a single shot fired at them toward their true, ultimate objective.
The final spaceport.
It is a profound, almost sickening visual contrast.
The elegant, pristine, silent xenomachinery floating effortlessly above the grotesque, muddy, horrific ruin of human and alien flesh.
The Aeldari High Command blindly believed that the ambush in the valley had been the final, desperate, violent gasp of the human defenders.
They firmly believed the human plague had been completely purged from the approach, and the war for Canaz was effectively over.
They assumed, with absolute arrogance, that the spaceport would fall within hours of the transports arriving.
But they made a critical, fundamental miscalculation.
They assumed that because the physical human body is broken, the human spirit must also be broken.
From the smoking, blood-drenched, corpse-choked ruins of the central trench, Commissar Kalen Vork sat upon his mutant horse and watched those sleek alien ships fly effortlessly overhead toward the spaceport.
He was completely surrounded by the dead.
His command was shattered,
His flanks were gone.
but Vork himself was entirely unbroken.
The manuscript describes him staring up into the swirling psychic snowstorm, the harsh red glare of his bionic eye piercing the darkness, coldly tracking the trajectory of the enemy transports.
And amidst the deafening wind, the burning tanks, and the moans of his dying men, he made a cynical, chillingly calm promise.
He looked at the sky and said, "Soon all this will end, but not the way this alien scum thinks it will end."
The ultimate evaluation of the ambush in the valley is highly complex for our department.
The humans unequivocally, disastrously lost the territory.
The valley was taken, the flanks were completely annihilated, the armor was rendered to slag, and the final spaceport was exposed to direct, heavily reinforced assault.
But strategically, the humans forced the highly advanced Aeldari to bleed heavily for a trap the Xenos arrogantly believed would be a simple, clean execution.
They killed a Wraithseer.
They brought elite jet bikes down into the mud.
They caused massive, humiliating casualties to the Aeldari infantry.
They proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the pristine, arrogant Aeldari could be dragged down into the freezing mud and made to die just like everything else.
But look deeply at Vork's final words. He isn't expressing a desperate hope, is he?
It's not a prayer to the Emperor for miraculous salvation.
No. He is expressing a cold certainty born of pure, distilled, hyper-weaponized hatred.
When a commanding officer watches his entire army get butchered, watches the enemy completely bypass his position to strike the final civilian stronghold, and still coldly promises the absolute annihilation of that enemy, well, you have to wonder.
What horrifying darkness is he still holding back?
What unspeakable catastrophic measures has he prepared at that spaceport that make him so entirely confident in the Xenos demise?
That is the exact question that haunts the deepest archives of the Logos Historica Verita.
The ambush in the valley was not merely a battle, it was a microcosm of the larger, darker universe we inhabit.
It is a place where survival demands unimaginable, unthinkable, and often highly immoral sacrifice.
It is a reality where victory is often entirely indistinguishable from wholesale, localized slaughter.
The humans of Canaz did not win the valley, but they successfully weaponized their own death to extract a heavy, humiliating toll from a superior universe.
As we synthesize the grim reality of these recovered manuscripts, we must confront the true, terrifying nature of the Astra Militarum in the completely isolated Separata Sector.
They are no longer fighting for glory.
They are no longer fighting for territory.
They are fighting simply to make their own inevitable extinction as painfully expensive as possible for the enemy.
And that leads us to a final, highly provocative thought. A lingering, disturbing question that is not directly answered by the information data of Canaz, but one that you must mull over in the silent, shadowed archives.
We have seen, in excruciating, highly documented detail, the lengths to which humanity will go when pushed to the absolute brink.
We have seen them willingly use their own bleeding bodies as bait, their frozen tanks as static, buried tombs, and their own massive casualties as a strategic deception.
If this level of unhinged ruthlessness, this sheer psychotic dedication to mutual destruction is what they unleash when they are merely defending a doomed, falling position, well,
what catastrophic, unimaginable horrors will they unleash upon the galaxy if they ever manage to break the siege and decide to go on the offensive in this isolated sector?
if the standard defensive posture requires boiling mud, buried tanks, and the intentional slaughter of one's own men, what does a human crusade look like in the dark?
Keep this knowledge highly secure at Historicus Perfectus. The shadows of the historical recovery apartment are always watching, and the truths we uncover in the ice are rarely meant for the light.
The Emperor protects, but history remembers.